Welcome to this, I believe it is the 23rd senior reading. But it's also the first one back in this space where we always want to have it. And the last 3 years, the last 2 years were by Zoom, so it's great to be back here. The only other year that we missed being in this space was, some of you remember this, when there was a horrible storm and there was no electricity up here for a week and we had to be down main campus. But this is our space, so great to be back here and to see you all, and especially to get the opportunity to hear these really wonderful graduating student writers read their work. We have a really great group of students who will be reading tonight. So I will go ahead and introduce our first reader. And our first reader is Luke Edney. By the way, I should say we are reading bios the students provided for us. And so they may vary in tone accordingly. Luke Edney came to Berry College, a lazy history major from Edneyville, North Carolina, more concerned with playing basketball and skipping class than any creative pursuits. His RHW professor said of his final paper in that class, "This wasn't bad, I just don't know what the hell it was about." Almost a year later, faithless in his writing, he wandered into a randomly selected elective one Tuesday afternoon in August 2019. He looked around the room, saw 19 girls in a class of 22, and realized he picked well. Fortunately for him, that class was Creative Writing 250 with Dr. B. And upon receiving a series of high 90s and constructive instruction, he began to recover that faith, which blossomed into a great enjoyment of the creative process and writing as a whole. Now, with that faith restored, he plans to attend the law school at Ole Miss and become one of the 15 people to voluntarily populate that state. And hopefully one day write creative falsehoods for a few $100s an hour, as opposed to the roughly $5 per hour he has to pay for his current creative crutch, Jim Beam. His creative aspirations include getting a series of short stories published that he's currently submitting to a number of publications 2 years after he was first told to, as well as completing his only full-length manuscript that's currently worth a damn. Those are Luke's words. And hopefully writing an English language saga faithful to the Old Norse style. Please welcome Luke Edney.
I'd like to direct you to please ignore your chat books. I made a late minute executive call to read entire material that's not print there. So I apologize, but it is what it is. This here is an excerpt from one of those from the manuscript that was not mentioned in that bio, and here we go. The sun penetrated the great pines of Appalachia, shining onto the mossy dirt in that sharp orange shade native to the dawn. The light barely stabbed through those giant green obelisks and their branches so as to make every other step almost canopy. And on cloudy, darker days, a man was liable to not only get lost, but to be as good as blind unless he was a clever woodsman. A gust of wind came rustling through the trees, blowing the branches onto one another, entangling some and yet knocking certain articles loose. One pine cone, good size and shape almost black, was knocked loose from a tree not too high by an errant bough, and took the tumble from around 30 feet high, spinning end over end on its way down, whereupon it rather unceremoniously bounced off the head of an elk. The great brown beast stood over 5 feet tall, with broad shoulders and haunches that called to mind a draft horse or a woodland creature. A long pale scar marred his left shoulder all the way back to its stomach, marks of many a maiden struggle gone by. Indeed, on his antlers, around 4 feet broad and 6 feet long, chips and knocks were marked for forking out in so many smaller patterns, like the Mississippi into the Gulf, and some were yet stained crimson with blood. This was a bull elk, an ornery son of a bitch even among his kind. He was no passive prey. Thus ran the thoughts of the hunter, who cocked back the hammer on his long rifle, thumbing the metal with care as he peered down the sights with his right eye, and left one shut on a long-formed habit. He was crouched on one knee, his right toe dug into the dirt behind him, twitching slightly and turning out patterns of indeterminate shape, even to him, into that soft ground. As he lined up his shot with that squinted right eye, his voice ran in a low murmur under his breath, murmuring a song he had first heard as a boy and had only reached his ears from his own mouth in the last decade. As me and me mothers was going to work, we met with the devil, 'twas in the dark. He finally lined a shot up, right in the gut of the great beast, about where his lungs would lie. All sound had ceased, and the hunter experienced a moment of great clarity, where the very world around him seemed to pause. Birds falling silent from the various melodies, the only sound proceeding from the breeze against the leaves. That was all the backdrop, a setting for a grand portrait. The one thing that was real was the hunter himself with his rifle in his hands, lined up 100 yards or so from the grazing elk, and then the old time drinking hymn under his breath again. I went up with me peg, and more just so neat, I knocked off his horns and likewise his clipped feet. He squeezed the trigger. A deafening blast went off, and while the barrels were moving from his head and a slight deafness in his right ear caused by just such shots as these, less than the acoustic impact, he still recoiled the slightest bit of the sound. The rifle bucked, and while his grip was strong enough to control the instrument, it smote his shoulder well enough to make him wince, right in an old wound. Smoke rose, clouding his vision and rising into the air as though he were holding a campfire at the end of his hand. When the ringing in his ears had finally cleared, the last recesses of birds clearing the area post-haste immediately filled them. Some even crashed through branches in their frantic exodus, clattering off the wood and through the leaves to the earth below the sun's devilish hat. What was the name again? He smiled fondly at the sound. Occasionally some birds would have their paths entirely derailed by such, and their necks would snap as they hit the ground, thus simply seeking to save one's hunger and have the effect of creating its own exclusion. Even a wider was his grin as the elk, already weak from its recent battle, took 2 steps, staggered and fell, bellowing in his mortal agony. One shot, lad, and that's how a man does it, indeed it is. The hunter propped his rifle up against himself as he stood, the butt angled on the ground as he doffed his tan leather tricorn and wiped the sweat from his brow. He took a breath before calling out in the hopes that his fellows hadn't wandered off too far.
Aye, boys, and I think we've got us a big one over here.
The hunter took his flask off his hip and drowned a healthy swallow and a half of whiskey before he strode on to the carcass of the beast he had just slain. He restored his hat to the top side of his head, grinning to conquer his grin along with that of a man who was just provided for him and his, and set that head back down as he walked. As he stepped into the light, the wolf came and jumped him, crashing into his left side and knocking him clean to the ground, passing over his legs and onto his chest. He cried out in that odd mixture of surprise, fear, and awe with a little self-consciousness thrown in, eerily similar to that of a man caught with his pants pulled down in someone else's bedroom. In fact, the image of that very situation flashed through his mind as he went down. He got out of that jam by rapid movement and force, but holding a man down on the ground with a knife in his hand and keeping back the ravenously snapping jaws of the wolf were 2 different animals, progenitor action alike. Yet his coarse, weather-beaten hand managed to wrap around the wolf's muzzle, and a jerkily thrown knee pushed the wolf back up and off his body, over his head. The hunter scrambled to his feet, but the wolf had leapt back up onto his back, where he clawed and tore with his teeth at the man's coat. The hunter swung around, throwing his arms recklessly and catching the wolf flush on the side of the head with his left elbow, and with a yelp the beast was dislodged, quickly regaining its footing a few strides away. He had smartly stepped back once the wolf had been knocked loose and pivoted firmly on his right foot back around, pulling his knife from its sheath. He held it forehand, arms swinging slowly back and forth as he and the wolf warily circled each other, which when he saw 2 more of the pack come forth in the background and caught another slowly entering the clearing from his left. The hunter grimaced, realizing how this scene would likely end, and gathered breath into his lungs and roared,
Lads! Lads! Help!
He spat into the dirt, adjusting his hips so he was more or less facing all 4 of the sun's surroundings. His rifle lay in the dirt now, both unloaded and somewhat useless as he didn't have time to face the lapse of bayonet. The wolves had come into more or less the same range, but had begun circling and equidistant from one another so as to complete their tactical envelopment. He kept turning, worried for an attack, but the wolves held back. Perhaps cognizant of the way the sun shone off the razor sharp tip of his blade. He yelled,
Well, go on then, you fucking bastards.
and made us to lunge upon the wolves. Each stepped back smartly, and in the same breath another leapt forward and clamped down with his outstretched arm. He cried out in pain and swung at the second wolf to his left, knocking it loose with a whimper. But by then they were all over him, pulling him down and digging into him with blade teeth and insatiable hunger. He cursed himself for a blind and deaf fool, the pain overwhelming him, scenes of his home crossing his mind in waves alternating with the agony of his flesh being torn asunder. The sun rising over the old mill on the Eaton, his family's old townhouse, the taste of Maurice's ad. Rufus, who always kept guard at the door with those clever dark eyes, tail flailing back and forth and never would return. His first woman, full of mindless adoration, the one who got him caught her, left its own kind of paradise, long legs wrapped oh so tight around him, her betrothed bleeding on the floor. Frenzy made on the passage over. His last horse, a small dappled thing, quick of step and finicky. His brothers, rich and fat and glowing in their matches on the Thames. His mother's grave, staring up into her sweet doughy face. He was 2 at the time. The sun setting behind the mill, him holding hands with the girl he loved, her green eyes flashing and sparkling. God, the pain. And then he heard yelling, gunshots, saw smoke in the wolves fall in short succession, her blood spill warming him with bathwater. He grinned weakly as the sun returned to his face, thought he sharp to last as much as ever. That's how it goes, I would guess. Bob. I wrote that 2 years ago. I have not looked at it in those 2 years. Well, not 2 hours ago. Sorry for stumbling. Now this is the only other piece I'm going to read. It's a poem I recently wrote for Dr. Nisa 470 class. It's called The Changeling. I've lost myself among young girls who wear tie-dyed shirts and Birkenstocks, marking their flesh with likenesses of bugs and birds, lepers, weaklings of the wild, reflecting themselves off those who won't revile them no matter how much they cry to his time. They smother their coughs like whispers forbidden, snuffed out in an echoing nameless night on the water, lungs showing their gentle souls that have bruised themselves on the world, and now lift those salty cuts as they pass me with blunt. It shows me what he's got to do. I shave my hair loose, crescendoing down, a curtain unveiling the high of the set, and the stage is reset for the second act, the metamorphosis. As the audience sidles through the seat gaps and rediscovers his places as prodigal sons, their eyes return to him upon the rostrum. Someone else entire, another man who manifests before them, identical yet adventitious. His features well-known cousins to their forerunners. Where he was disheveled, he's now combed immaculate, pensive of thought, not slow of speaking, weighted tones, dulcet phrases of greatest gravity, abstracting and elusive, no longer wild and unhinged, the drawl dragged down to uncharted depths, devoid of pastoral diction and uncoarsened like stropped leather, until it slides tenderly through their ears as honey down the throats of would-be opiated masses. A soft and nameless rage become a meditation, examination of the world our mother, and her various merits and faults which we would do well to love for their import towards our own. We are hardly granules of dirt at the foot of such mountains as are found in the wildest fiction, stone citadels of myth. To believe otherwise, to dash yourself against vanity's rocks along a shoreline so vast she is called Cosmos, creator of all. He is the folk philosopher now, not the Appalachian redneck. He speaks to them with a terrible clarity emanating to the roots of their very being, with a truth unlike any other. It's their truth, after all. Their truth is one of vagary, sweet nothings, and inevitable defeat. One that I scorn as infantile idiocy, and he holds as holy writ. That's about doing a Jim Morrison impression to impress stoner chicks. Thank you.
So, where is she? Hi, right here. Hey. So, reluctantly, I'm going to introduce Kyla. Kyla's amazing. She's my advisee, and I've decided that she can't graduate, so I'm going to favor her. She's to stick around. I'm also kidding. Kyla is graduating with a degree in creative writing and vocal music this spring. She hopes to continue her studies in England at the University of York. That's a place. Where she will pursue a master's degree in medieval literature. How do they say medieval over there?
I think just like that.
Just like that?
Yeah.
But like cooler than
Medieval.
medieval. Okay, cool. Medieval literature. Yeah.
That was Valley Girl.
Oh, that really bad at accent. She will be returning to her research from her study abroad, focusing on new historicism and feminist critiques of medieval medieval texts, particularly in the Christian tradition. It sounds really awesome. She hopes to publish work on proto-feminism in medieval Europe and highlight female leaders in the Catholic Church. At Barry, Kyla's writing has been featured in both Ramifications and Valkyrie magazine. Long term, she hopes to break into the publishing industry with books of poetry as well as prose. Kyla wants to return to her community in Atlanta, where she hopes to musically perform and continue to volunteer with Capernaum, awesome, a branch of Young Life for teenagers with disabilities. Please welcome Kyla.
I was going to point out that I came to Barry wanting to study fiction and ended up taking all poetry classes. I loved it.
Noel avec the moon. Every week before Christmas, I walk to the moon. She looks pearly smooth and luminescent. From afar and through Galileo's telescope, modeling the cosmos in his looking glass. She is pockmarked and frozen, a rock isolated in the blanketed heavens. Actually, the moon is carpeted by lavish red velvet and accompanied by stars radiant in opulent showers of hematite and dust. She hires a band, jazz music swelling and billowing down like rivers of honey, whispering to her erudite friends. Breathless sin and tanzanite stones skate together across the opaque night in crystalline succession, and waves of polished servers attend to the gods. The moon covers her crevices in sequin gowns, hiding carved away places where her love once was. Astronomers long since coined her bliss as lunar oasis, sea of tranquility, the shining face, and speculated jealously. That celestial object of copious silver swirling in the sky, no one sees her hidden caverns which shiver and threaten to break. Moonquakes, disguised as opulent beauty, colored violet and charismatic, splinter into her. Frosted baubles swinging from her ears, full of beggars wishing to the moon on one translucent night. She is a binary star forever in orbit, never to share the warm embrace of another celestial being's gravitational touch. I drink champagne among the stars. The heavens a palace one evening, I belong. Walking back home, she kisses me goodbye, her touch is silken stone. This is Persephone. But my grandmother says life is long, all in one sigh, loosened from her tongue. She rolls around each syllable like it's creamed corn or pomegranate seeds in her mouth. She says each as if the words slipping out between the taut corners of her lips will save me from despairing over a man without my name. Self-made. I weaved violets, many vines, a dreamer's blush, their resplendent fog, when hung a lighthouse in bitter crisp July. I steered a heart of nightingales from sunburned sands, jaded from bathing in the stars and heavily undone by their threads. I filled myself of lavender-drawn memories in caves not meant for me. At dawn, while shadows drown, I carved my personhood. Russia is free. In a frosted Moscow night, hidden underground, a sea of well-dressed blue blood swirled within my sight. Erudites with shimmering golden jargon curling in their tongues, holding cigarettes and dripping where a heart should beat. Rivulets of oleander cherries to his heavy suit have clung. Jubilee, sing comrades and workers, Rusija is free, and I, having found asylum far from their crude celebrations, deep in the crushing cerulean, a passage collected from tears and plum, weaving my woes of being Moscow's wife, finally freed from the cooling air that choked my obedient, sinful life. Definition. Music is a bird that drinks her song, gulping the water of pure notes. Silence is the caged bird who gasps for air, staring at her reflection in the lock. Now moving into fiction. Buried 6 drinks deep. Excerpt. The ghost who haunts Foundry Magnolia Cemetery finds me, drunk on my tears, somewhere between the 4th and 5th step to the basement. It takes me a moment to notice my bottle of $8 wine bouncing away from the crippled prison of my hands, and longer for me to see it floating above my face. If he, the ghost, he looks like a he, thinks I'm crazy. Well, God, I'm not crazy. It certainly doesn't show, or I guess doesn't show through my lipstick lines and caked-on concealer. He's holding it, and I see his translucent fingers wrapped around that ridiculous bottle that had been on sale at Target, sloshing with some pink, sweet, watered-down poison. He brushes my bangs away from my forehead. I hate those bangs. They're sexy pick-me bangs that my ex said made my forehead look smaller. Now those shears-off trusses of regret are long and currently soaked in sweat. He doesn't seem to mind. He hadn't seemed to mind when I broke in the bathroom mirror or cry-screamed at a 3 a.m. recording of Pride and Prejudice. I guess ghosts don't mind human tragedy. It should be noted that so far, he has not made himself all that visible to me. He mostly slips vitamins into my vanity and kills bugs that crawl through the moldy floorboards. At first I thought he was a mirage formed by a cocktail of Xanax and rosé that had been medicating my body for the past 2 weeks. I suppose a more sober person would have assumed that they had acquired a squatter. The thought did cross my mind, but only briefly. It was quickly overshadowed by his transparency, and the fact that when I threw a Windex spray bottle straight at him, he literally evaporated into thin air. But he was not the evil murder your cat and set your hair on fire sort of apparition. His hauntings were more reminiscent of a nursing home caretaker. That is, up until last night when he literally carried me back to my bed. Regardless, I had not gotten used to his sudden appearances despite the increasing greetings. This is another excerpt. This is from my first ever class at Barry, the tea shop. If the young couple taking tea were at all concerned with a shadowy figure observing them from a dark corner, they would not show it. They were so infatuated with each other's eyes, lips, and hands that no movement apart from their sphere of impenetrable devotion was noticed. In fact, no one in their little tea shop seemed to notice that occupancy of the plush velvet chair was taken by anyone other than the resident cat. Under the conversation and fits of laughter were the quiet, methodical sounds of a golden pocket watch swinging and the crunching of chain against leather. Even more hidden away, much like the figure, was the clicking in place of its tiny arrows circling inside the elaborate machinery. Tick, 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 tick. A dark leather glove snapped the pocket watch shut. Unfolding the legs, the figure pulled herself out of the shadows, rising into the warm light of a hanging chandelier. A blonde woman wearing felt wingtip shoes, a pinstripe vest, and ebony pants rose to the spotlight. She sashayed over to the submerged couple and tapped the man's shoulder, a delicate whisper on the suit made of fine wool. The last thing I will be reading is No One Asked for Trauma. No one asked for trauma or the recitation of wails that sound like screeching tires. No one wants the avid nightmares scratching up and down the sensitive skin of your inner thighs. No one desires accidental triggers that send shrapnel exploding onto the front lines. God, is this a war zone? No one stopped me from crushing into powder and swallowing it with orange juice at 7 a.m. No one told me I was lose this much from gambling with my life. No one asked for trauma that never leaves.
I'm Dr. Will Donnelly, and I'm introducing Karis Morgan. With a major in economics and a creative writing minor, Karis Morgan has often been told that these are an unusual combination. However, she has enjoyed the calisthenics of developing both the left and right side of her brain and whenever possible, has married her love for the dismal science, like economics, with creative writing. She has particularly leveraged this background in her honors thesis, drafting a dystopian novel set in a future inspired by economic-themed research. If you look closely, a few economic terms even slip into her poetry, which she truly fell in love with this past year. After graduation, she plans to continue to develop her writing craft and pursue a career that fulfills both her economic and creative interests. And I'll add that I have been working with Karis on this thesis, and it's really, really good. So with that, please welcome Karis Morgan.
I wrote this semester about the nature of anger in general, not for a specific person. Okay, the bliss of rage is that instead of I hate myself rotating in my mind like a skittering record player, I hate you cycles to a merry-go-round, jaunty too, and that's such more fertile ground to dig into, full of forgotten tubers, sickening roots, juicy larvae to grind under my mind's heel, while the scorched earth of my own self-loathing is more like a possum's carcass picked through by the buzzards to only the ribcage, claws upward, splaying open, its own pelt of the soft face and black eyes cocked sideways at me while I was walking by. And now look what I've done, comparing myself to the roads killed in order to huff the fumes of my own rage, backfiring to the moon, the engine sputtering, self-combusting, pistons slurping out parodies until the flight stalls, reverses. The next one I'm going to read is sort of a little political, but I usually avoid politics, but then sometimes politics comes after me. So I'll keep this one. This one's not too long. American roulette. The needle, the stick, the jab. To dine indoors, to stay employed, to see your grandfather. But my body, my flesh, my choice is just telephone, wire, play pass it along until it ends, someone. But I thought making this political. False information distorts, only polarizes, adverse effects bleed between the lines, thrombosis, myocarditis, the unknown, the fear, factions that know we're a mass ball of dancers and one of us a witch. Could converge at half finger her wing while others fondle her upper arm, once, twice, 3 times a bruise. A better understanding? Now it's personal. The selfish, the small-minded, the conspiracists. Beware fake news. If I knew it was fake, why would I? The big stick, the clotted blood taking bombs. How can I falsify the unneedled arm murders? My mother were begging you. Spin, click, trip the trigger. Choose who to hate you. Okay, and then we're going to end with excerpt from my honors thesis that I worked on with Dr. Denali. The novel isn't finished yet, but this is one of my favorite scenes at the end where all the 3 main point of view characters meet. And so, you know, it's Bennett, one of the characters, is interacting with Taeyong. Bennett stood and shook her hand. It was slender and cold, almost papery in texture. He offered a guarded good night. He had a feeling this woman was either a miracle worker or was swamping him with impossible tasks, maybe both. Taeyong seemed to read his reservation. I'll compensate you for an expensive directly related to investigation, but not for unrelated misfortunes. She glanced at Mads when she said this. Bennett felt his jaw tighten. Her tone, the way she had ignored Mads the entire time, had rubbed him the wrong way. Mads told you that she was evicted from one of the housing complexes you managed, didn't she? You could find her place to stay with a single call or rent her a room with what's pocket change to you, but let me guess, you tore her down instead. Taeyong didn't react, her eyes black and unblinking at the edge of the light in the food stand. I'm a businesswoman, she said. Look for someone else to hand out charity. She turned and strode down the street. Bennett watched her disappear, into the shadows and shook his head in disgust. The information she provided was useful, but he didn't relish talking to her again. He turned to Mads. Sorry about that, she needs a piece of work. Mads shrugged and slipped off her stool. She crossed her arms, her hands hidden in the ends of the jacket sleeves. Which way do we go? Bennett shouldered the canvas bag and started out from under the edge of the canopy. The rain had slowed to a thick mist, but the cold hadn't let up. The road was empty except for 2 strippers smoking thin pipes in the storefront window. Even they seemed weary, ready for the night to be over. A taxi went past them down the street and appeared, probably carrying Taeyeon home. I wish I could afford one of those, Bennett muttered. Mads moved closer, looking out. Somehow his jacket made her seem smaller than normal. We could take the T, she said. We wouldn't have to walk much that way. Bennett nodded. That's a good idea. Side by side, they left the meaty smell of simmering soup behind and waded back into the city. Tired and numb, they didn't speak, keeping their eyes fixed on the ground with woody cracks streaking the asphalt. Mindless, the city sprawled them into its waking sleep, tram cars pumping through arteries to the slow rhythm of an aging heart. In the mist above, lights shimmered like halos in the night, 1,000 angels sweeping above the streets.
Our next reader is Jacob Pritchett. Jacob has been writing stories since his elementary days in Montgomery, Alabama. It wasn't until high school and beyond that he discovered just how life-changing storytelling can be. At Barry, he refined his craft and discovered his untapped love of poetry. After graduating, he hopes to work as a copywriter and focus on publishing his stories. Eventually, he hopes to earn his PhD in creative writing to work as a professor. Jacob.
Thank you, Dr. Meek, and thank you all for being here. So I'm just going to be reading from the chapbook. This first piece is an excerpt from Sunlight, which is the one and only fiction piece that I have published so far. So this was in RAM. So yeah, this is an excerpt just from the beginning of Sunlight. Dad doesn't speak during the 3.5-hour drive from our cottage to the hunting club. He never looks at me either, just looks straight ahead at the gray dirt road guarded by a dense wall of pines. Now and then, I look in the rearview mirror and watch the dust swirl from behind the pickup truck. Our rifles clank against each other in the back seat. He had gotten me one a week before the trip, unannounced. I had turned 14 a month earlier, and he got me nothing. "We'll be hunting caribou," he said. "Figured it's time I taught you what it means to be a man." He said it not expecting a response. Dad has a calm, slow way of speaking that makes whatever he says irrefutable. Saying no to him may as well be saying no to God himself. It was comforting when I was little, in the winters where the sun barely showed itself, when the nights closed in on all corners, and his commanding voice was all that held my world together. Now it scares me. In my gut, I know something isn't right. After a while, we passed the gates of the hunting club. When we finally arrive at our trailhead, we get out and unload. The lukewarm air has the faintest chill of early fall. It makes my nape hairs stand on end, even as I struggle with supplies Dad hands me from the truck bed. Once we're set, we lock the truck and hike into the forest of golden aspens. I soak in the scenery and try to ignore the weight of my backpack. We bought a week's worth of provisions. I just hope that's not how long he plans on staying here. I take one last glance at the pickup truck. The sunlight glints in the windshield, half obscured by shadows stretched across the gravel lot. I wonder how we're going to get a caribou all the way back. Isaac. My heart lurches and my eyes snap forward. "Yes, sir?" "What do you plan on doing with your life?" "I don't know. I think I want to be a teacher. A teacher? Yeah, following Mom's "that won't suit you." I know not to say anything. We traipse on, ascending gradually. The dense foliage blocks the sunlight until the forest around us creates the imitation of night. It's here we set up camp. I put up the tents, and Dad builds a fire. We eat a brief meal and go to bed early. The sun doesn't set, and it won't set until much later. Dad says we're getting up early. The hunt begins tomorrow. A little bit of foreboding. It's in ramifications if you want to read the end. Check out the last issue. This next one on topic is The Hunt. This is a poem. This was actually the poem that I wrote for Intro to Creative Writing with Dr. Meek, and the first poem that I got published in RAM, so this one holds a special place in my heart. When we were younger, and the twilights lasted longer, and the shadows of the trees became beasts and spirits, a farmhouse was our kingdom, our ward against the demons, stretching across rolling fields lined by pines, dark warriors. Some nights smelled of fires. We gazed upon the embers. The shadows retreated to the forest and stared, eyeless, envious. Others smelled like carnage, like the night you came of age. You brought in your first kill, your face stained red, innocent. Washed away in the river on summer's burning fever, cleanse the blood from your face, I'll cleanse the mud from mine. Those nights were enchanting as we charged the darkness, sprinting to the safety of the fire at the bottom of the hill. But those nights were haunted. In the darkness we were hunted by something ancient stretching across the darkened field. Wait and watch a doe. The night waits and watches you. Hold your trigger before the sun goes down while all is quiet. Hold still. The night can hear you moving, but the doe can hear you moving, but the night is coming, sweeping, a scythe across grain from a field forsaken by daylight. Fire, light the fire. Escape the darkness is an ancient spirit warded off by fire. Don't breathe or the doe will hear you. Don't run or the unknown will find you. Don't keep me waiting. Fire. And then this next one is another poem, Small Gatherings. This one was looking back on when my sister got married, and just, this was during the pandemic, so all of the crazy nuances that affected that marriage and just that ceremony. So this is Small Gatherings. Vinca's pop, pink, white, among this terrace, someplace new, they sprout around the wooden trellis wedding on the hilltop with 12 distanced members. Blue Charlie dog bears the ring, and some Vinca's wilt under chubby paws. Today, bright May sun irradiates smoke, risen from the downhill grove. Just yesterday, our green horizon flooded white, a smoldering sea. Charred remains of wildfire spread among the longleaf grove, swept the hillside. Firemen gathered, dug barriers around the outbreak to contain. Smoke billows still as a planted kiss ends in song, my sister's wedding. Vinca's, I wonder. Every year, when the sun renews, do they remember when they sprouted up in isolated April, when tidal wave storms dropped veil upon veil over that Easter Sunday when church was outdoors? Do they remember the silent killer rasping the world still, while still these foothills rose up through shrouds of weeping thunder to the worship's call? Joy laced in their song, so enriched they filled valleys, now echoed in nay. Each new year transforms, and they come back, pop, closer to the longleaf grove. In time, they will come to the church across the valley, to small communions, to the wedding's last dance, when to be indoors killed more than wildfires. I hope they do see, through periwinkle eyes, each annual cohort, formed by remnants of the past, shared wisdom through fibers in the soil, through each event, share perennial communion in sickness or health. Okay, I'm gonna skip River Dreams because it's one sentence and I don't have the lung capacity. So we're just gonna go with the last one, which is Dinner. This is one that I wrote for advanced poetry this semester. Dinner. In the crowded restaurant, a toddler screams behind our table split between two conversations. I drift from both, my words falling dormant, and study the aquarium beyond the table. nod to the trapped slate parrotfish, and the motion draws its silver eye. But I glance away. The waiter had brought sorbet in tiny cups for us, and as we regroup, I think it was a kind offering. Then we resume, and I stay in between, words trapped within ice, longing for nothing, carving with the little spoon, sorbet in thin shavings, numbingly sweet, like winter spent alone. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce Michaela. Yay. Michaela Stansberry has been an avid fiction reader from a young age, believing it provides not only adventure, but an unconventional way of learning as well. She's wrong. Through her writing, she aims to give readers the same sense of wonder and curiosity she felt when she picked up her first novel. Michaela primarily writes short stories, but hopes to one day publish a novel. After graduation, she plans to earn a master's degree in creative writing and work in the publishing industry. So here's Michaela.
Thank you, Dr. Peters. I know that reading things that aren't just textbooks can help you learn, because I have learned far too much about cockroaches from Dr. Peters. And I'm going to be reading an excerpt from one of my short stories, Thanksgiving Dinner. Cooper sat in silence for a moment. It was like the table had been pulled in 4 different directions. Hey, Aunt Dixie? Aunt Dixie? Okay, never mind. Aunt Karen, can you pass me the dumplings? Nothing. He felt just as invisible as he had sitting 3 feet away with the toddlers. I'll just get it myself then. He reached for Granny's dumplings, conveniently located directly across the table, and huffed when his arms didn't span the distance. Half raising from his chair and planting a hand beside his plate, Cooper leaned over the soup tin casserole and a plate of ham. Just as his fingers snapped the handle of the pot, Aunt Gloria, who was sitting next to him, sneezed. Startled, he straightened, knocking his chair backwards, and yanked his arm, squelch, right into the casserole. Cooper could only watch in mortified horror as the dumplings rolled over the edge of the pot, across the table, and into Aunt Karen's lap. I'll get the paper towels. Here's some napkins. Go water rag. Make sure you wipe under the pot. Cooper watched, potato spotting his arm, as Aunt Karen's eyes welled. Oh no. I just wanted to have a nice dinner with my family and wear my new blouse, and now it's ruined. Oh, good grief, someone murmured. Cooper's mother jumped in. I'll grab you one of mine. What about the blue one you bought for me? Don't be ridiculous. That shirt is hideous. That's why I gave it to you. Sheldon was patting his mother's arm in support, though the corners of his lips were twitching. Now, Karen, Granny spoke, there's no need to talk to your sister like that. Why don't you head upstairs with her and find something else to wear, then we can finish dinner. No, Mom, I've had it. Every time I come to see any of you, I'm attacked. They're dumplings, Karen, hardly an attack. And belittled, and not once have any of you apologized. I work hard to take care of my son. I did my best to make sure Sheldon had a good role model, a good father figure in his life. I ask myself every day how they could be so selfish. How you tricked them into marrying you is the real question. Uncle Albert said, How dare you? I've never tricked anybody in my life. Cooper's father shoulders slowly. Right. Okay, just calm down. Aunt Dixie held up her hands in a placating manner. We're sorry we tease you so much about your husbands. We only do it out of love. If it bothers you so much, we'll stop. Promise. Well, Aunt Karen sniffed, if you promise. I think I'd like that new shirt now, but not the blue one. Of course. Cooper's mother stepped away from the table to guide her upstairs. We'll put that one in the wash while we eat. The pants, too, if you want. As Aunt Karen stood, a dumpling slid from her shirt, hitting the ground with a wet splatter. This proved to be too much for Sheldon, who gave a loud guffaw. before bringing his hand tightly over his mouth. Who thinks this is funny? Aunt Karen rolled around, eyes roving the table, finally landing on Cooper, who was still mimicking a deer in the headlights. You. Now, Karen, Cooper's father started. He hasn't done anything. Hasn't done anything? He's the reason for this whole mess. It was just an accident. Shut up, Dale. You know as well as I do that these two let him run around like some kind of wild animal. Cooper's mother drew back, affronted, but it was Uncle Albert who answered. You're one to talk. I've seen yours digging worms for snacks. Albert, don't antagonize her. Well, I never, Aunt Karen gasped. My Sheldon would never do such a thing. He's a smart and mature boy, not like that one. I would appreciate it if you stopped insulting my son. And I would appreciate a family with a little more self-respect. Come on, Sheldon, we're leaving. Finally, Uncle Albert called gleefully, raising his flask in mocking salute. Let the door hit you on the way out. Granny made a motion towards the door, but Aunt Eloise stopped her with a hand on her shoulder and followed Aunt Karen out. Don't worry, I'll get her. In the silence, their muffled voices could be heard at the door. The screen banged, and an engine roared and faded. Aunt Eloise gave a small smile as she re-entered the dining room. She's going on a short drive to clear her head, maybe change clothes. She'll be back before long. Well, Granny cleared her throat. Let's finish eating, shall we? We'll save them a plate. And Albert, put that thing away. You know better than to have it out around the children. Why? It's not like they know or care what it is. It doesn't matter if they care or know. It's still inappropriate. Aunt Dixie and Aunt Gloria quickly finished cleaning and riding the disturbed table. Cooper's mother handed him a damp paper towel. Humiliated as he was, at least he wouldn't be sticky. Granny spoke again. Everyone, just relax. We rarely get to see each other like this, and I'm not going to let a little mishap ruin the rest of the evening. Her eyes were narrowed at Albert, who still sipped from his flask. Cooper leaned back, shifting his weight, only to miss the still askew chair and land heavily on the floor. He stared, dazed, at the underside of the table. And this next one is an excerpt from another short story of mine called Cognitive. We appreciate you agreeing to speak with us Miss Knight. It's no trouble, really, whatever I can do, but I'd like to keep my daughter with me if that's all right. She won't be disruptive. Of course, Carson agreed, if that's what makes you most comfortable. Miss Knight pulled a notebook and a pack of crayons from her purse, as well as some small plush dog. Here you go, honey. I have to talk to these agents for a few minutes, so you need to be quiet, okay? Are you going to talk about the pretty lady? Yes, we are. Okay, Mama, I'll draw you a picture. Thank you, honey. Miss Knight watched her daughter settle into the corner, then turned back to Carson. We're going to do what we call a cognitive interview. It's a technique to retrieve memories by recreating the environment using sensory details like smells, sounds, etc. We'll be recording for evidence in case we need to use it later. Any questions? Miss Knight shook her head, and Turner started recording. You spoke with the perpetrator on the plane, correct? Yes, she sat across the aisle from us. When you first saw her, what did you hear? Yelling. I was trying to put my carry-on up, but the man behind me was getting impatient. Could you do that any slower? Some of us want to take off on time. I'm sorry, sir. Just give me a minute. Clara felt her face heat and shoulders. Claire felt her face heat and shoulders tense with each new annoyed face that formed a line behind her. Here, let me help. The girl sitting across the aisle stood, placed her book down, and shooed the man back like he was a particular irritating fly. I'll turn this case and you can slide yours right next to it. Thank you so much. No sooner was the overhead compartment closed than the boarding passengers pushed through as though they were water bursting through a dam. A few of them sent dirty looks her way. Clara busied herself with setting up her daughter, Jenny, for the flight. The tray pulled down and the headphones sat on top of it. They were joined by a coloring book, a pack of crayons, and a book sporting a cartoon monkey on the front. The child was busy staring out the window, and Clara took the opportunity to go ahead and fasten her seatbelt. Mama, what are they doing? They're loading our big bags so we don't have to do it by ourselves. That's nice. I'll make them a thank you picture. Jenny flipped through her coloring book, opened her crayons, and she decided on one. She's so sweet. Clara turned her attention across the aisle. Thank you. I do my best. The girl laughed. Well, your best is wonderful. I've seen too many misbehaving children. Been on too many flights with them, too. Oh? Do you travel a lot? At least twice a month. I think of myself as the errand girl for my company. Sounds exhausting. It's not too bad. I get to meet some interesting people. That's not always a good thing. The girl laughed again. That's true. The two fell into silence for a moment before Clara said, I'll let you get back to your book now. Half an hour later, Jenny was absorbed in a Disney movie, and Clara was fighting to stay awake as she read from the magazine. There was movement in the corner of her eye, and she looked up to see the girl standing from her seat. Is everything all right? Yes, I'm fine. But you should take your daughter to the bathroom. What? You should take her to the bathroom. The look in the brunette's eyes reminded Clara of her attorney right before she won the custody battle. The woman pulled Jenny from the movie, ignoring her protest, and walked to the back of the plane. I heard the gunshot while we were there, but I didn't know what it was. Then the flight attendant walked us back to our seats. Is there anything else you can tell us? I don't think so. Thank you again, Miss Knight. Officer Don will escort you and your daughter back. Thank you.
Thanks, Michaela. I remember both of those from class, and it was great. It's my pleasure now to introduce Sarah Vest, whom I only met in person yesterday for the first time. She's delightful. Sarah is a graduating student of economics at Berry College in Rome, Georgia. Outside of Berry, she lives in Maryville, Tennessee, with her 2 dogs and her functional internet. In her free time, she enjoys playing video games, napping, and pondering the concept of owning a stove with 4 working burners. She has completed her honors thesis as a collection of creative nonfiction essays, from which Infestation, which is in the chapbook, is excerpted. Please welcome Sarah Vest.
This piece fought me tooth and nail trying to excerpt it. So what I'm reading today is an excerpt of an excerpt that I took. So if I start reading this and think, man, this beginning sounds really abrupt, and this piece sounds a little bit unfinished, that would be because the beginning is abrupt and the piece is unfinished. Without further ado, there are a few things as frustrating as being unable to dig out the root of a problem. You can't pull a weed if you can't tell it from the flowers. I could explain the variables around me. I could describe everything that was happening to me before the panic rose like bile. But I couldn't for the life of me identify what the cause of these fits were. A knock on my door and a long, quiet talk with my mother after a particularly nasty wedding reception, and we agreed that I had likely experienced an anxiety attack. It wasn't my first one, not by a long shot, but it was the first that had been noticeable enough to catch the attention of anyone but my own self. I started counseling in January. The knowledge is power approach to spiders was imperfect, but it worked better for spiders than it ever did for the true bane of my existence, house centipedes. Saying the words is enough to make my skin crawl like the creatures I so hate, because spiders, at least, mind their own business. I have a spot, they have a spot, and we both stay in place like good roommates. House centipedes are nosy little critters, not shy of humans in the least, and they seek warmth wherever they can find it. Cracks in the walls, steamy bathrooms, between bed sheets. At a sleepover in my early childhood, smoothies in colorful cups and hands, I witnessed my friend close her mouth around a chunky, fun-sized plastic straw and take a long drink. If you've never heard the noise someone makes when they suck a house centipede directly into their mouth, count yourself lucky. I still blow through straws and peek down through them before I risk a sip of anything. It was hate at first sight, even before I knew what they were. A flash of brown, a swath of greasy long legs, hair thin. I've never felt disgust quite like it, and evidence suggests they hate me back. Now, Rachel meant well, I'm sure. It was her job to mean well, after all, and Rachel took her job very seriously, and literally. She was a Christian counselor, and in retrospect, I'm not entirely sure she was actually licensed, but she was the person my parents had hired, and I was 15, so she was all I had to work with. And at first, that was plenty. I was still anxious beyond a functional level, and I wasn't necessarily finding any wonderful techniques to handle that, or at the very least, I wasn't using whatever I had learned. But having someone to vent to without guilt eased more than I'd imagined it would. The room was cozy, a step away from cramped. I'd sit on a little green couch set in front of a coffee table. Rachel would offer me a Sprite from the mini fridge in the corner, and we'd talk for our allotted hour when my mother sat outside in the waiting room down the hall. I suspected my anxiety stemmed from a deeper problem, and after weeks of seeing Rachel and trusting her with my thoughts, I did decide to bring it up. It started one night when I woke up in the dark to a light tickling on my cheek. In my half-sleep state, I reached up to brush it off, and it crunched. My half-hearted swat lurched into a frenzy. I had no idea what was on my face, but it was wriggling, and I wasn't taking any chances. So I clawed at my face, my own nails leaving red marks on my cheeks. After I was sure it was off, shuddering, I bolted up to turn on the light and turned back to look at my bed. It was carnage. Twitching legs, disembodied where I had ripped them from their host, covered my sheets and pillowcase. The convulsing, nearly legless body of a house centipede lay, broken but seemingly alive in the midst of this wasteland. My face still burned from my self-inflicted violence. It was 3 a.m. when I checked the time. I would have to go back to bed eventually. Dutifully, I left my room and returned with paper towels, individually plucking each leg off of my bed to dispose of it. When I finally reached the bug itself, which appeared to still be somewhat alive, I still couldn't bring myself to crumple it and throw it away. I picked it up in a paper towel, deposited it on the floor under my dresser, and spent the next half hour washing my face and hands till they were raw. I slept on the couch that night. There's no good way to tell someone that you don't want to exist. Too casual and people think you're joking, too serious and they worry too much. It took weeks to summon the courage to bring it up with Rachel, and I still remember the discomfort of trying to downplay it, but not too much. I also still remember the complete indifference in her voice when she asked me if I was just being dramatic. And the terse reminder that she was here to help with my anxiety, not with whatever this was. So we should get back on topic. I remember the clinical tone she used as she informed me that she would have to tell my mother as I was a minor. And I remember being unable to look either Rachel or my mom in the eyes when they spoke after seeing the hurt on the latter's face. It was a quiet ride home. We never spoke about it again. I stopped seeing Rachel a few weeks later. The thing about the house centipedes in my room is that no one else ever saw them. They appeared more often after the first incident, and I developed a habit of checking my sheets and around my mattress before I got into bed every time I decided to crawl into the covers. I would walk into my room and see a brown blur scurrying underneath my bed skirt. I would walk into the bathroom just in time to see the legs vanishing down the sink drain. They were everywhere, constantly, and I complained about it to other members of my household, but it was apparent that I was the only one experiencing the issue. Neither of my parents had seen them around, and even in cases where I saw them in other parts of the house, the living room ceiling, the dining room walls, they seemed to escape the notice of everyone but me. It was maddening. It was a problem only I could see. We called the exterminators once after a while of pleading for some sort of solution. It was no wonder why only I saw them, we found out. They lived in the mulch outside, crept up through the cracks in the bricks and in through my walls. Only my room was above the garden they made their home in. House centipedes are predators of spiders. They're harmless, creepy though they may be, and in some countries, Japan notably, people can even keep them as pets, much like how one might care for a tarantula. They're nocturnal hunters and are wonderful at keeping away many other household pests, such as ants and termites. They're known for being remarkably well-groomed as well, regularly cleaning themselves after their meals. I know all of this. I hate them anyway. I didn't see many spiders during the era of house centipede terrorism, admittedly. I'm not sure which I would have preferred to have, neither if it were up to me, but clearly it was not. They don't coexist in reality, but they occupy the same space of unbridled loathing in my mind. Depression and anxiety are contradictory. It's the inability to care versus the propensity to care entirely too much, and having both at the same time is the mental equivalent of chugging a bottle of NyQuil and a Red Bull. The ups and downs, the cycle of each of them is unpredictable. Waking up to be unable to get out of bed, or going to bed to be unable to sleep. Waking up ready to face the day, going to bed and soundly falling into pleasant dreams. I don't know how to clear it out. This isn't a problem that has a resolution. Not one that I can reach on my own anyway. But it is livable, and so live I shall.
Thank you, Sarah. Probably have nightmares after that. Thanks to everybody, though, for coming out tonight. It's always kind of bittersweet to, kind of tell people goodbye, but at the same time, I mean, the amount of talent we've heard tonight is astonishing, and we're going to miss all of you very much. So we've got some refreshments over there. Feel free to stick around for a little bit, take pictures if you like, hang out, and thanks for coming so much.